So this session on trauma-informed feminist leadership, I think, is really timely. There's been a lot of work over decades on what trauma-informed organisations should look like, what they mitigate against in the populations that we work alongside and the people that we work with. But we know that the pandemic has affected and impacted on people in a disproportionate way, and people whose mental health has already been under strain because of the early life experiences, because of the environment that they're living in. We know that they've been disproportionately affected by COVID, and we do know that the referrals to mental health services are on the increase. We know that eating disorders are on the increase, self-harm is, suicidal ideation is. We're expecting to see our students and our colleagues to be really quite considerably impacted. And how we manage that as an organisation will either support and mitigate against the disadvantage, or it's going to perpetuate the trauma. So I'm really excited to be delivering this. It's one of my, it's something I feel very passionately about in organisations. So leadership is a practice, not a position, I think is something that we're all aware of, this concept of leadership and how we practice it, what informs our practice, and what we deliver and what we model to the organisations that we work in. So the first question, and it was just to open up a little bit of discussion, is this very... Trauma is a word that gets used, misused. Its definition seems very elastic. It has a very specific definition in the medical DSM definitions, but it has a very different definition, I think, amongst the population. And I thought it might be useful for us just to take a few moments just to discuss what our concept of what trauma is. And I'd like to open this up to everybody to comment on what your perception of trauma, what is it? So throwing that open to anyone who'd like to pitch in.
Gosh, trauma. I suppose it's when you can't deal with something. It's out of the ordinary, and it's shocking. Maybe that's the sort of feeling that I feel from trauma. It's something that is extraordinarily different to what you're expecting.
Certainly the first part of what you said about it overwhelming, I think, is a really critical part of it. It overwhelms our capacity to cope. And the question and the debate about how extraordinary it is, I think, is a really interesting one. And I think it's where feminist theorists have changed the narrative about what trauma is. The old definition was that it was an exceptional and extraordinary experience, like a near-death experience.
I think that's right. But I think also it's about, for me, trauma is about being kind of like thrown into certain situations, whether they're life situations or work situations, feeling that, having that sense of being overwhelmed, but not being in control. I think that, personally, to me, that is about where you've got no control over the circumstance or the situation that you find yourself in.
Freud wrote about the traumatic reenactment, that people find themselves so out of control when they're in a situation of trauma that they reenact over and over until they gain mastery, until they can feel that they are in control. So there's a pattern of people who've been traumatized exposing themselves to additional trauma, and that's that I think we see when we see people in situations of violence, repeating patterns of being attracted to aggressive and dangerous partners, that this idea of us being out of control and that being a terrible feeling of powerlessness, I think, yes, is an essential part of the experience.
I like your use of language of powerlessness, because I suppose that is how I would define it. It's, as you say, not in control, not being able to do anything about it. But it's also seeing, you're saying how it's changed, and I can see how, just watching my staff, how some of them are really traumatized by this whole pandemic and are feeling really overwhelmed. And whereas some people have other coping mechanisms, others don't. And it's really interesting to see how it impacts on people individually, I suppose, whatever that might be, and how their lives are really challenged by something that other people might think was quite simple.
Yes, and I think that in studies on post-traumatic stress disorder, it has been an area of a lot of research, why it is that two people can experience exactly the same situation. One person develop PTSD and one person be seemingly absolutely fine and have no reaction whatsoever. And I will talk to that a little bit as we go through the presentation. Any other thoughts before we move on?
Just Googling in the background as well, just to look at what defines trauma, and obviously it's interesting, it uses the word distressing, but the other thing that I'm interested in is the fact that it's the same symptoms that you would be suffering from if you had stress, or similar symptoms are the same as trauma ultimately. So the same physical symptoms you would get, like lack of sleep, insomnia, dizziness, headaches, gastrointestinal, the same ones that you would get if you were suffering with any type of stress. So yeah, it's that whole big thing, as you say, of being out of control, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that leads on very nicely to my next slide, which is the stress continuum. And we talk about positive stress, so I expect you're all familiar with the bell curve of stress and performance. And actually, initially, stress does improve performance. You know, we all know that sharp thinking that comes with the anxiety before you give a presentation or go into an interview, that it can make you very alert. But as stress continues over a period of time, the bell curve dips and we see performance deteriorating over time. That we can, as human beings, as animals, we are very, very well designed to manage short periods of high stress, but what we're not designed well for is prolonged periods of stress over long periods of time. That has a really detrimental impact on psychological well-being, but physical well-being as well. So on the stress continuum, we move from positive stress to tolerable stress. So this is where we're still able to function. It's not overwhelming. It might be very uncomfortable, it might be very unpleasant, but it isn't particularly damaging in the long term. And from tolerable stress, we move into toxic stress. And I think this is where feminist perspectives are interesting, because the old definition of trauma was either it was an exceptional thing that was happening, and it was either fear of dying or witnessing other people dying, or the integrity of the body being violated. So if you saw somebody being injured in a car accident, for instance, or you feared that you might be very seriously injured or could lose your life, and that was the kind of exceptional situation that was described as trauma. And then Judith Herman's book Trauma and Recovery, which was a seminal work which really changed a lot of people's perspective on what trauma is, she challenged this notion that it's exceptional. And she said that actually that there's a huge number of women who live with extended periods of trauma through domestic violence, through harassment, through fear. And she wrote also about poverty and discrimination as being traumatic incidents which are not exceptional. In fact, they're endemic. They're very, very, very common. And it isn't a one-off incident. It's the trauma of living with these huge stresses over long periods of time. So this toxic stress becomes traumatic stress. And I think it's useful to think about this in terms of the pandemic, that we're maybe working alongside colleagues, or we have students who've been traumatized through austerity and the impact that that's had for a decade. We'll be working with people who've had disadvantage on all sorts of different indices, who've experienced toxic stress, and it's been impacted and impounded by what's happened with the pandemic, with fear, with communities being disproportionately affected, and through poverty, through fear of homelessness, through not being able to escape from domestic violence and harassment in the home. And so we do know that this kind of long-term trauma has a huge impact. So we'd like to, given that we're a fairly small group, I wonder whether we want to have a breakout discussion. To what extent are you aware of trauma in your community, amongst your colleagues, amongst family and friends, amongst students, amongst the partner organisations that we work alongside, society in general, our own organisation? And we've included, you might want to consider how it's touched your life, because it felt that if we didn't personalise this and think about it, it would be a huge omission. Because people, you know, our leaders are impacted by trauma as well. That this may be something you'd want to share and may not be. But bereavement theory, I think, is very helpful in the looking at recovery taking an extended period of time. That we tend to think of recovery as being on a linear trajectory. So you're a bit better, bit better, bit better, bit better, and then you're fine. And actually, no mental health recovery happens in that way. It's always up and down and sideways, and you feel a bit better for a while, and then you have a knockback and you feel dreadful and you think you're back to square one. So I think even letting staff know that that's very, very, very normal response to bereavement is really important, because it is, particularly if people have had a cumulative effect of multiple losses, it can feel absolutely overwhelming and traumatic. So many people would be, as you said, surrounded by death. It would take time, for sure. So position, you're in a really good position to model the importance of self-care. For a leader to say, I am doing this for my mental health, I am taking this afternoon off, or I am going to do this because I need it, because it then really gives permission for other people to think that this is a priority. My pet hate is this obsession people have with the word resilience. I think that our understanding of resilience is that if you're not coping, it means there's something lacking within yourself. You're not strong enough. You don't have the mechanisms. Whereas I think distress tolerance is a better term. I think the idea that we're under a situation which is really distressing, and how can we manage that? How can we support people to get through that? And I think when we're thinking of resilience, it's sometimes helpful to go back to physics and go back to the meaning of the word. And resilience comes from the idea that you test a property under extreme circumstances to see the point at which it no longer maintains its form. So the resilience of a piece of steel, you would put it under extreme heat, extreme cold, extreme pressure, and the point at which it disintegrates and it doesn't hold its form is its resilience, its point of resilience. And I think when we think about that in terms of human beings, we are talking about not that you're lacking something, but the pressure is so great we cease to function. That it's not something lacking in it. We can improve our capacity to cope, certainly, but it's not about the individual having something lacking within themselves. Shall we move on? So just I like this from Devon Grilly. She's a writer that I follow, and I think it's important to remember that there are more people than you think for organisation who already have traumatic backgrounds and who are having a hard time keeping it together. You have more people than you know who are in the midst of a months-long traumatic cycle who are not going to be able to hold it together for much longer. And you may be one of those people. And I think that's it. I think actually it's not something that needed to be said from what I'm hearing from you. We're all very aware of this. And that women are disproportionately affected by the pandemic, both socially and economically. And there's a lot of debate to support that. So just to sort of contextualize the pandemic and to think about the allostatic load. So allostatic load, this refers to the number of different stresses that people are under. So if we have somebody who is experiencing social isolation because they're home working, because if they've been bereaved, if their income has been affected, so they're worried about whether they're going to become homeless, whether they'll be evicted from where they're living, whether they're worried about putting food on the table, if they're, the allostatic load is the how stress compounds with multiple stressors. And we know that people's physical health is the vulnerability to ill health increases with the amount of, if you're a smoker, if you're a drinker, if you have obesity, if you're that all these different factors will increase the likelihood of poor health outcomes. We also know that mental health outcomes are affected by the number of stressors in your life. And we know that from the intersectionality that there's issues of social justice and health inequalities that come with disadvantage and discrimination. And all these combine to impact on people's capacity to manage the stress that they're under. So when we're looking at why somebody could be very, very deeply affected by the pandemic and other people seem to be muddling on but getting on fine, it could be a difference in the allostatic load, and it could be stresses from childhood that are unresolved, or it could be just a combination of events that people are going through at the moment. But we do need to, I think, hold awareness that sometimes we only see the tip of the iceberg and we don't know what else has gone on previously or what else is happening in people's lives. And very relevant to this, I think, is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which I don't know if you're familiar with this. I'm sure you probably are, so I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but it was a massive, groundbreaking study in America in the 1990s, where they measured how many adverse childhood experiences across a very large section of the population. And what they called adverse childhood experiences were physical or emotional neglect, mental ill health in the household, bereavement, being exposed to domestic violence, a member of the family being incarcerated. These were all sort of very, very big detrimental experiences, and they found shocking numbers, a huge number. I think it was 61% had experienced at least one of these, and something like 15% had experienced 4 or more. So it was, and this wasn't, I mean, it wasn't done in a sort of particular community. It was done across a very broad section of the community, and they were really, really shocked by this. And what made the study most interesting was they did a longitudinal study of the impact of these childhood experiences, so that they could draw, we always, I think, knew, but this gave data to the fact that if you have adverse childhood experiences, not only does it affect your physical health, so we know that children who are exposed to trauma, it affects their health outcomes. They have inflammatory disease that can cause metastatic cancers, neurodegenerative disorders. It affects heart development. The impact on the physical self is huge, but also the social outcomes. So people who, the more exposure to adverse childhood experiences you had, the more likely that you would come under the criminal justice system in the future, the more likely you would have drug and alcohol difficulties, dependencies, poorer educational outcomes, less likely to be in secure employment. It was a huge wake-up call to how important it is that we protect children and that we mitigate against trauma, that we put into our education system factors that will support children to come to terms with the experiences they've had, because their health outcomes, their mental health outcomes, their social outcomes are so deeply affected by what happens to them in childhood. So this is just an image to show the pyramid of ACEs. So you have the adverse childhood experience, it disrupts the neurodevelopment and allostatic load, it impacts on the social, emotional and cognitive impairment, there's an adoption of high-risk behaviours and crime, it creates disease, disability, social problems, low productivity and early death. So there's a data set that proves this, and I think it's a huge societal issue. This was a bit of data that was collected by the Greater London Authority just in 2019, and it shows the prevalence of ACEs in England and Wales and Hertfordshire, Luton and Northamptonshire and Blackburn and Darwin. So we can see that 4+ ACEs, we've got between 14% down to 8.3%. So this is a really significant proportion of our population have experiences 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences. I think it's deeply shocking. I think it's really quite disturbing that that we have this data coming in. This I've spoken to it, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but it just shows the prevalence and impact of the ACEs. So this is on Open Commons on the British Medical Journal, and it shows about having everything from cancer, violence, drug use, heart disease, respiratory disease, and it goes on. So it does affect pretty much every aspect of people's lives and the outcomes, long-term outcomes. And you can see the huge impact of having the greater number of ACEs. Following on from ACEs, Kanwapol, so Kanwapol Dalawal did some work. This is another American theorist, and they added in the importance of race in terms of ACEs, because it had been missed out really in the first study. And this shows that the historical trauma, the societal conditions and the local context as being actually the bottom rungs of adverse childhood experiences, that growing up with microaggressions, implicit bias, affects the architecture of the brain. It has a deep and profound impact on people's outcomes and very much belongs within the adverse childhood experiences milieu. So what is the impact of trauma? We've looked a little bit at the sort of the big data and looked at long-term outcomes, but what might we anticipate seeing in the organisations that we work in? And this is from Sandra Bloom, who's a fabulous American psychiatrist, and I really do recommend her creating Sanctuary and her Sanctuary web. If you're really interested in this, do have a look. She publishes lots and lots of papers on it, and really her specialism is trauma in organisations. And she writes about the lack of safety. So her not controversial thought is that the reason that we can get out of bed in the morning and get ourselves up and out and to work is because we have a a sort of basic unconscious assumption that the world is a relatively safe place, that we're welcome in the places that we're going into, that we're going to be okay. When you've experienced trauma, that assumption is shaken and sometimes is destroyed. So when you feel that getting out of bed, that leaving your home might be a life-threatening experience, we can start to understand why people find it so very, very difficult to engage in what we would consider to be very normal day-to-day functioning. But if you feel very, very, very unsafe, you don't trust the people around you, you don't trust the air that you're breathing to not be contaminated with a contagious disease, we really have a real challenge in managing that in an organisation where people are coming together in close proximity. Hyperarousal, I think this is the description of how this might manifest would be, for instance, if you were mugged, you would imagine quite easily that for quite some time afterwards, if you're walking down the street, you'll just be very acutely aware of what's going on around you. And if someone's walking behind you, you'll be tuning in with your hearing to how close, are they speeding up, are they getting near to you? Hyperarousal is this sensory experience of scanning the radar of the environment, looking for threat. And it's exhausting. So people with PTSD often say that they find just the most simple, just popping to the shops to get a pint of milk can be absolutely exhausting because they're in this very heightened state of arousal, of looking for threat and feeling afraid. And of course, the emotional dysregulation is when people are having huge mood swings and getting very angry, getting very triggered, getting very distressed and upset, because the system of regulation, which relies on safety and feeling contained, has been disrupted. So seeing these three, we can imagine how this would affect people in the classroom and how it will stop people from being able to learn. So we know that people who've been traumatized have a cognitive rigidity. It's very difficult to relax into thinking, to use the memory. If you're highly aroused, your emotions are highly aroused, it's very difficult to think logically, and the failure of developing creative problem-solving skills is that's going to affect people just in terms of not only learning but navigating their way through a social environment, doing the interpersonal stuff of being in a team or being in a classroom, being given an exercise and having to work collaboratively. Alexithymia is the inability to articulate feeling. So this often comes with trauma, that people find it very difficult to communicate, find it very difficult to describe what's happening to them in a way that other people will understand. So you may have somebody who's presenting as extremely angry, and it could be that this is a secondary response to feeling really frightened or feeling ashamed or feeling humiliated, but the communication is distorted, and the way they're presenting their distress to the world is through rage and anger, which obviously is destructive for the environment, but also deeply problematic for the individual. And this last one, I think, is also a challenge to our organisations, and this, I think, does come from early life experiences. Particularly, one of the things about trauma is that it's so unfair. It's so, when you work with people who've been traumatized and they ask that question of why did this happen to me? Why me? And it can't be answered because there is no justice to trauma. It's just wrong. So if it happens early in life and if it happens repeatedly, we would anticipate that somebody's moral development would be impaired. You don't have that idea that we have a social contract, that we're all owe each other respect, that we owe each other sort of reciprocal behaviour, because if you've done nothing wrong and horrific things have happened to you, it does disrupt moral development. So we can find people very preoccupied with vengeance, which can be about feeling empowered if you felt very disempowered, or self-gratification can come from a real need to feel that the needs are being met on a very deep level when needs haven't been met and there's been a failure of containment.
Just a couple of things, Jane, that you've kind of triggered is, and I think it's kind of from the ACEs, and then since you've presented those findings, it's that stuff about in education, we might then make the argument quite often that that evidence and data in a public health sense, because we're talking about this coronavirus, that's kind of part of our context too, is that we should do more about adult education, because those are the parents of the children who are experiencing, those are the parents whose children may well develop even in childhood cancers, etc. And that's the case for adult education, but make it, as well as for adults themselves, but making that case always falls short of funding and change around adult education. And that at some level, some of the separation off of prison education from more general further education has also served to stop us looking at that. Do you know what I mean? I think we were much more aware very often of that relationship between children and young people whose parents were in prison, but also children, or the parents of children who had a parent who was in prison from time to time, shall we say, in their life kind of. And I think that that's a real gap in coronavirus, is that adult education is really poorly considered. Fettel published something yesterday, but really it was the very first thing around leadership that had been published around adult learning. They've been remarkably silent in this, and the government's remarkably silent. So in the guidance that we got this week, it said, this is what you're doing for young people, bringing everybody back. And then there's a little paragraph that says, of course, for adult learning, colleges, because of course the guidance has only talked about schools and colleges, but we have to be grateful that colleges even have a presence these days. It says, you'll have to judge that, how you bring adults back and whether you keep them remotely or what have you. And so again, that risk of childhood experiences being compounded by us not thinking that through. And I know that the Children's Commissioner has been desperately trying to put that information in, but the focus is almost entirely on to get the children back to school, and that will protect everything. But actually, it won't protect everything. And there's a real gap there that keeps coming through. I think that further education is going to be part of, an adult education in particular, it's going to be picking up those pieces for a generation or two.
Well, I certainly think that, everybody knows, don't they, in adult education and functional skills, that if you've got an adult who hasn't got basic literacy or numeracy, unless they have a learning disability, something has happened to that person. People don't reach adulthood without those functional skills unless something fairly dramatic has disrupted their education as a child. So the likelihood is that there is trauma, and that will affect their capacity to learn as adults, because it affected their capacity to learn as children. So, we really need trauma-informed teaching of functional skills in adult ed and everywhere, I would argue, because it is so common, it is so prevalent. But I think you're right. I think the FE environment, we know that we have large numbers of students when they're making transitions in their lives, that often that's come out of necessity, it's come out of severe hardship, it's come out, we know what our populations are in our colleges. I would agree with you. So a psychoanalytic approach to looking at trauma looks really at the idea that we defend against anxiety, and that this is a very primal human drive, that we need to protect ourselves, that anxiety is overwhelming. And if we look at organisations as being living bodies, that there are organisational defences against anxiety. And this is really why trauma-informed approaches are so important, because if we don't adopt this, these are the sort of problems that we would anticipate coming across. So when an organisation is defended against anxiety, there will be resistance to change, because change is unsettling, change is frightening. Appointing a leader and then subverting their attempt to lead. This is a very common thing in group dynamics. This happens really as a group dynamic. Attacks on reflective spaces. I think reflective spaces bring up lots of anxiety because we don't know what's going to be exposed in a reflective space. We don't know whether painful experiences are going to be explored and talked about. And if we're defended against hearing these narratives and the impact that they will have on us, we will close down reflective spaces. Splitting, this is Melanie Klein's theory about how we manage overwhelm, is that we split into an idealized and a denigrated. So when people are splitting, they tend to see one group as being all good, and everything about them is admirable, and they're really idealized. And the denigrated are the ones that then get cut off, split off, and we may find sometimes organizations will denigrate the students. The whole student body will turn into being a problem, rather than the people that we're working with, our clients, our where our energies are going. Or certain groups of students will be seen as people that we need to get rid of, that we need to, if only we could get rid of these people whose attendance is poor or whose behaviour is challenging, then we would then function much better as an organisation. So we can see splitting going on, and it happens in staff groups as well. A hostile dependency is a very, it comes out of the pain of dependency, I think, of people feeling that they resent the fact that they need to be part of the organisation, they need the job, or they need the students being dependent on the teachers, or the teachers being dependent on the organisation, or that it brings about feelings of frustration and rage. An atomized defense is where we cut ourselves off and distance ourselves from the people around us. So we might see people under a lot of stress who seem to isolate themselves and go into quite a cut-off place, and if they get stuck there, that's really problematic. A nihilistic defense is a defense against helplessness, and we know what it's like when we go to meetings and we have the relentlessly negative person who seems to be totally hopeless, unable to see goals as worth working towards, or very destructive to other people's morale and very destructive to other people's attempts to be constructive. And the antisocial, the blame, the gang-like against a common enemy. This is very closely related to denigration in the splitting, but we do see in organisational defences a blame culture of people not wanting to take responsibility, not feeling comfortable taking responsibility for fear of blame. Defensive practice, so working in a very rigid, very constrained way, not managing risk but being risk averse, and that of course is very difficult to then bring about change if people are risk averse. And the gang-like states of tribalism within organisations, where there's a lot of competition rather than collaboration, and people feeling that they're pitched against one another rather than us all working towards a common goal. So these are what we would call organisational defences, and the staff defences within are the risk avoidance that I've spoken a little bit about, this defensive practice, a defensive use of hierarchy. I think that that's a challenge for a lot of colleges, which can be very hierarchical organisations, but this kind of idea of shutting down people who are beneath you in the hierarchy, or only certain privileged people having access to information, lack of transparency. And again, it goes against the possibility of collaborative working, a role rigidity, projection, which is the idea that we feel incredible discomfort with parts of ourselves. So instead of acknowledging them and working with them, we project them out onto others, and we see those aspects of ourselves in others rather than seeing them in ourselves. Blame and acting out, and the sickness, absence, and presenteeism, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with what those are. The presenteeism is people sort of being there in body, but maybe not much else. And the issue of sickness and absence when anxiety is very, very, very high. The student defences, I had a fascinating experience last April. I worked at the Nightingale in London. It was the early days, so it was at a time when we were imagining it was going to be full. And I worked in the faculty team, which was preparing people to go into the hospital. And it was unique in terms of NHS leadership, because the challenge was so enormous. And one of the things that they identified very, very, very quickly was that communication was going to be extremely difficult, and hierarchies were going to exacerbate the difficulty. You know, that we had to flatten the hierarchies immediately, which was really against the working culture of most of the people who worked there. But what was discussed and what people found really challenging was the idea that had the Nightingale been full, the noise would have been immense. From ventilators are very noisy machines, and it was a big, echoey, huge space. And if there'd been 5,000 ventilators in that space, it would have been deafening. And if people are wearing full PPE, it's extremely difficult to recognise who people are, even with written on. It's very difficult. You can't lip read, you can't hear what people are saying. So we were looking at how can we flatten the hierarchy so that anybody feels that it's their duty to challenge anybody else if they see them doing something that they think is wrong. So if they see somebody putting the wrong drug in, how we were teaching people how to use sign language, to use a kind of BSL to communicate. So stop, go outside, this isn't how you do it, or take a break, you look overwhelmed. And just getting people to buddy up, to think about their psychological needs, to think about really essential communication, and to try and break down boundaries of blame, so that people could feel comfortable challenging, but also comfortable being challenged, that we were all sort of understanding that everybody was under exceptional pressure. And I really look forward to it being written about. I'm sure people are writing about it now, but it was there's a lot to learn from the experiment that was the Nightingale, and what came out of the learning that went on there. The student defences. So these are the students' defences against anxiety. So we have dependency, that people can become very powerless when they feel overwhelmed by anxiety. And what we don't want is our students to feel dependent at a point where it becomes disabling of them, not being able to speak out, not being able to take risks, make choices, take ownership, take authorship of the decisions they're making. We see often in traumatized organizations this grief to grievance movement, where people are are feeling sad, and they express that through rage and anger and blame and making complaints and feeling mistreated and not being able to understand the processes. So splitting this comes up everywhere. It comes up with the students, with the staff, and with organisations. But we see the denial, the sickness, the passivity, and despair. And despair is such an essential part of depression, isn't it? And it's something that when we're asking students to really put themselves out of their comfort zone in order to reach a goal in the future, the idea that they're working hard now in order to get their qualification, to gain the skills, to move on, we need them to hold on to hope. We need them to have that goal. And if that goal is lost, why is anybody going to work towards something? And it worries me a lot, the things that have been said about our young people, about the unemployment rates, the difficulty that young people are experiencing post-college in finding apprenticeships, in finding jobs, or the ones that may go on to higher education, what's happening in higher education and how that seems very precarious at the moment. That despair is going to be something that's going to be a challenge for us to tackle, I think, to reimagining hope and encouraging people to feel that there is a future that's worth working towards. So there's also management defences. So these management, if we think of our leaders and our managers as being the containers of the anxiety of the organisation, so the leadership team really functions as a container. And if the anxiety in the organisation is overwhelming the capacity to contain, there will be defences against that experience. So we'll have denial, we'll have intellectualisation. I think everybody in FE and adult education is so accustomed to the constant reorganisation, and know of places where bullying and scapegoating is endemic. Manic defences, I think this is also speaks to this idea of transparency and good effective communication, that there are organisations where only good news is allowed. You're only allowed to say things that are happy. And I think there's room for good news, and we do want to hold on to hope, and we want to hold on to the positive. But I wonder how many people here have experienced that sort of relentless thing of Zoom staff meetings where you're showing your children's lovely painting and the cake you baked and the snowman you built when there was a bit of snow, and actually it does feel a bit manic. It feels a little bit as though the other side of what people are experiencing is not being given a space, and we do need to be alert to that. And another management defence is the confusion of roles. And I think, the manic defence, it really comes out of the idea, again, a psychoanalytic idea of the paranoid schizoid position, which is just a total denial of reality, because reality is so depressing. And it's hard to sit with painful feelings, and we fear them, their contagion. There's so many parallels, aren't there, in what's going on with a virus. But I think people really do fear that if we open Pandora's box, that it'll just flow out and spill everywhere. But actually, when we do deny it and we don't enable a space for it, people then become very isolated with their personal experience. And as you said, the idea of people feeling that their experience isn't a shared one. We know logically that it is shared, because we know that this has been a horrible time for everybody. But when there's only good news allowed, we get the impression that everybody else is coping with it really, really well, and that drives despair. That's a really horrible experience for people if they feel that they are unique in their incompetence, or that their resilience is so low they can't manage it. So yes, the I think it's useful and important to think of it coming right from government all the way cascading down the country and affecting all of us. It's not helpful. How do we create a trauma-informed organisation? This infographic I quite like, because I think it gives us hope. And these are the core principles of a trauma-informed approach. There is no simple, straightforward answer, but there are things about how we practice as individuals and a culture within an organisation that supports people in trauma. And safety is absolutely the core of managing people who've been traumatized, because if you've been traumatized, you do not feel safe, and you take that feeling of not being safe wherever you go. So creating safety is essential, and we do that by being trustworthy and transparent. So being consistent, not treating one group differently to another group, by looking at our organisational practices and being transparent about them, why decisions are being made. That's been spoken of, the importance of communicating why. Peer support, I think, is incredibly important, partly because you know we have an enormous resource in college of really fantastic people. We've got you know, our colleagues and the relationships they build, and one of the the cultural things that was put in at the Nightingale Hospital was this idea of buddying, and how important it is to have a little check-in in the morning of how are you today. And that was really a key part of the sort of preparing for the work and putting on the PPE, was that people would check with their buddy. You know, did you have an argument with your partner before you came into college? Did you not sleep before you came to work? How was your sleep last night? Have you eaten anything? You know, there's just this sort of well-being, so that you knew if somebody was really struggling that day, and you could really keep an eye on them and be aware of their needs. And that, I think, maybe one aspect that could be useful going forward as the students come back. Collaboration and really looking at power differentials and how these can be levelled, how we can squash the hierarchies and make shared decision making, so that people can feel responsible, that they can feel included, that they can feel heard. Empowerment, this idea of this comes from the NHS, so it's talking about patients, but our students and staff strengths are recognised, built on and validated. So it includes a belief in resilience and the ability to heal from trauma. And I think there's some really lovely work by Professor Papadopoulos, Renos Papadopoulos from Essex University, and he's written extensively about trauma-activated development as an idea that we often see people as traumatized as being very damaged by their experience, but he acknowledges that he's not in a manic defense against acknowledging damage, but he also writes about how it can activate development, and he talks about the people who have terrible life experiences and go on then to really cherish every moment that they're on, every opportunity they've been given, because they appreciate how important it is and how valuable it is. So the idea that we can hold both sides, that we can hold that some people will come out of this experience damaged, but other people will come out with huge energy and drive and enthusiasm and really want to make the most of life because they're alive. And a humility and a responsiveness. And I think that this is really, really important. And it was, you know, it was no coincidence that the Black Lives Matter movement really came to the fore last year. And you know, I think a lot of people are very worried that it hasn't maintained its that people haven't maintained their interest in really exploring historical trauma and looking at discrimination and bias, because we can't have a trauma-informed approach without looking at racism and discrimination and how that affects individuals, colleagues and students. It's got to be central to a trauma-informed approach. So this is one of my favourite quotes, and I've thrown it in because I think it makes me smile whenever I hear it, and it's from George Bernard Shaw, saying the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And I think we could all relate to the idea that we think we've said it, and we think they've heard it, and then we realise they haven't. And how do we have communication, and how do we check that we've heard, and how do we check that the communication has been effective? And I think that's a challenge to everybody, and it's certainly a challenge in leadership, is not to assume but to check. So the principles for becoming trauma informed: avoiding trauma and re-traumatizing those working and learning. So when we're looking at creating safe spaces where people who are feeling vulnerable won't be exposed to harm, we sort of think of the medical idea of do no harm, that's got to be a founding principle in what we're doing when we're working with others. Another really important part is reflective practice, that we create an environment where there's support for examining and critiquing experiences. And I think when people are feeling very, very vulnerable, opening yourself up to critique from others and our own self-critique feels very dangerous, and it feels we need to be careful that that it isn't evoking or triggering feelings of blame and scapegoating. That I know from other networks that I belong to that some people are doing sort of performance reviews in the workplace, and of course that brings up huge anxiety in people who are feeling that they're going to be judged and found wanting, and great anger and rage that why would you be doing it at this time. And people delivering services are saying, well, they need to prove that their services are effective, and of course we need to review performance all the time. We need to know that what we're doing is evidence-based. We need to know that what we're doing is effective. But creating a space where people can feel confident and comfortable enough to expose themselves to critique, to self-observation, to critical thinking, to evaluating their own practice and listening and accepting others' perspectives, which I think that's a challenge, because I think the sort of rigidity that comes with trauma really makes this a big challenge for all of us. And creating a reflective space, we need open communication, and we need to promote trust and value diversity. And I'm sorry, this slide seems to have been cut off. I think what this says is help all to understand how their work relates to the organisational goals. So this comes through good communication, but it also comes through this sort of flattening the hierarchy and helping people to realise that everyone is a cog in the machine, and if any part is not functioning, the whole doesn't function. So going a little bit further into safety, because it is so essential. I'm just on the top of my head, I've forgotten who said it, but there's a very famous quote about what trauma is, and they say it's a catastrophic failure of containment. So people have found themselves very exposed and very unsafe, and we need to really think about where people experience violence within an organisation. And we normally think of violence as being behavioural, we think of it being enacted, but of course people experience violence on all sorts of levels. People experience violence through bullying, through not being invited to meetings, through being given an excessive workload, through not being involved. people feel. So we need to think about symbolic violence and how it's embodied in discriminatory language. And we need to think about systemic violence and decolonising the curriculum and looking at our ideological systems and looking at where people experience violence who have already been traumatised. If they come into an organisation that doesn't look at these, there will be re-traumatising. So we could have maybe a little discussion about what forms of violence exist in the education system. Gosh, I think we could speak to what's happened, you know, how we can be treated in the way that we're treated by the Education Secretary, by the government, but it exists on a grand scale, but it exists on the micro scale as well within our organisations. And you know, what are we aware of in terms of violence, and what practical steps could we take to make the environment safer? So maybe we could talk for 5 minutes or so about that. It's a big topic, but does anything spring to mind?
I just wonder whether there's a certain amount of gaslighting goes on in the sector. I think it's about that good news story stuff, isn't it? I think we have a tendency to be a bit self-congratulatory and good news story and a bit complacent, and particularly around, I think, around equality and diversity and inclusivity and things like that. So, you know, it's like a couple of years ago, I suppose, was that the NUS report came out around levels of sexual violence against students in the sector, and 1 in 7 young people experiences that. And it was a kind of complete revelation, wasn't it? And nobody ever thought to ask about, well, is this happening for staff? Because we do that kind of, possibly, we're all nice people, aren't we? You know, there's a bit of a denial. So I do think that one of the kind of forms of violence is gaslight ourselves about things. We don't talk about racism in the system, do we, at all? Or, you know, gender, I guess, but lots of ways. We don't ever have really any kind of visible leadership around disability, or, you know, people with a disability. It's those sorts of things big, and yet we call ourselves and we think ourselves as being all wonderful and great people who are fair and equal. And my thought anyway.
I think one of the things there for me, Catherine, that you just triggered was that stuff, you know, when we looked at people with mental health problems and their experiences of further education, and how things like audits of both staff with grievances and students who were disciplined or asked to discontinue were often people who'd got mental health problems, but the system just didn't go looking for it. And that's been true across all of the kind of marginalised and protected groups, really. And it's almost like it comes around occasionally rather than it's kind of at the core of what we do. And one of the things that always worried me most about the Community Learning Mental Health Project was the way in which teachers had this belief that adult education could only do good and didn't accept that it could do harm to people. And yet every adult educator is happy usually to say people need second chance education because initial education has failed people and has done them some harm. And adults will often tell those stories, and yet we struggle to hear that. And I think until we can hear it, so like the sexual harassment by staff or of staff in the sector, and also being willing to look outside of just colleges for it, I think until we can look at those things, actually it's really hard to make the change in anything but when a crisis happens, when there's a piecemeal problem, etc. So we almost need more people calling out what happens in order for us to accept it as an issue and deal with it, I think.
I'm just thinking
I think I agree with you. I'm just going on to that next question: practical steps you can take to make the environment safer. That can do all this, feels a bit unsafe, doesn't it? Calling out.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely part of the nub of the problem. Really, is how frightening it is to name it, is to acknowledging it and seeing it and making space for the people who've been damaged by it. And I think there's a lot of resistance to going there because that feels very frightening. So we've just a little over 5 minutes, and so I'll just run through quickly the commitments required to becoming trauma informed. So emotional intelligence is, they're all knitted together. They all overlap. The idea that we can discuss feelings, that we can notice that people are struggling, that we can understand that behaviour is communication, that we can respond to the communication in a way that isn't violent, that isn't coercive or exclusionary. Social learning, this comes out of therapeutic communities and the idea of people learning from each other, learning from experience, honouring pre-existing knowledge, adapting knowledge that we learn together, and when we learn through experience, that consolidates our understanding. That open communication, and I think lots of people have said this afternoon about communication and how important it is, and how we can open up channels of communication, how we can listen to the staff voice. I really like that, because we hear student voice relentlessly, but I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about the staff voice. So yes, absolutely. That we work in a democratic way, that the community is cohesive, and we look at what drives against that cohesion, what splits people, what creates divisions, and we work against those. And that social responsibility and social justice must underpin that we have an understanding that trauma does disproportionately affect some people, some groups, and that there must be acknowledgement of that there must be resources put into mitigating against that we support everybody. And becoming trauma informed involves growth and change, and that is exciting and terrifying. It's something that we can embrace, but we also know that people are fearful of change, and people have gone through such an accelerated period of change in the last year, from embracing technologies to managing really, really challenging situations. And I think resistance to change is likely to be quite a big issue as we go back into colleges, that people are going to say, they've had enough change, they just want to go back to the familiar, they want something of the reassurance of sameness, but we know that it can't be. That's not possible. The old systems perpetuated trauma. We need to move forward into a better way of doing things. So the last one, and I thank Tina particularly for bringing these issues to the fore, was about the management of trauma globally and what's needed in the aftermath of the pandemic. And I think our trust, I talked a little bit about the trauma being a failure of containment, and I think we have all felt the shock of how failed we've been by government leadership, but also a kind of global leadership. And we're looking at inequitable distribution of vaccine, and we're looking at how the systems have really been so under strain, and really poor decision making. The absence of a coordinated multilateral response from countries is a shock. We're a year on, and we're not seeing what needs to be put in place, and we're seeing a rise of nationalism, and we're seeing silos, and the whole sort of distribution of vaccines, I think, is really disgraceful and shocking. The coronavirus has shown the limited value of borders, that viruses don't know they exist, that we need leaders to step up and work collectively. Absolutely, we need this to be modelled on a global scale. And we see women heads of state doing a better job in many cases than their male counterparts. So apparent and so true. And the inability of multilateral systems to demand a globally coordinated response, and in the face of populism and nationalism in countries like the US, Russia, Brazil, and sadly here in the UK, it's very frightening. Feminist organising and trauma-informed leadership by men or women are counterweights to this, that this is a way of us doing things differently and doing things much, much better. So we're right up at time. So I very much hope that you'll be coming to the action learning sets, and we'll be able to really sort of go into detail about some of the ways of moving forward and putting this into practice and looking at the challenges in our organisations. Thank you very much for coming.